are at the African Unbound Museum to have a conversation with Dr. Rahel Kassahun. Welcome. We are entering a peaceful space. Good afternoon.
Welcome for coming.
Greetings. This is your new Pan-African show called Africa, and your host Dr.Rahel. Today we have an exciting show. We're actually at the location, and this location is called African Unbound Museum, actually the African Unbound Museum. We have an amazing guest for you. I will turn it to her and ask her to actually introduce herself.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming to the Africa Unbound Museum. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to introduce to your audience who we are, what we do. The Africa Unbound Museum, I'll start with the museum and then I'll introduce myself because we are inextricably connected. It's an expression of me and vice versa. So, the Africa Unbound Museum is a Pan-African establishment. We opened our doors about 2.5 years ago here in Addis Ababa. This is an educational space. It's an educational and transformational space. Our objective is to introduce a culture of excellence. A culture of excellence in the context of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is a very broad concept. It has been developing over the last 120 years or more. And then recently we also, here at the Africa Unbound Museum, we introduced a concept. We didn't actually introduce it, but we're developing it, the Pan-Ethiopianism concept. So why the Pan-African Museum? Why the Pan-African Center here? My name is Dr. Rahel Kassahun. First and foremost, I'm an educator. And then I'm a development economist. I started my professional career teaching at the University of California in Riverside in 1996. Since then, in 2002, I joined, fast forward a bit, and then in 2002, I joined the World Bank in Washington, D.C., and I've been working as a development economist for about 10 years. Before I decided to go into the private sector. When I was at the World Bank, I had an opportunity to travel to many, many countries across the continent. And I learned about what a beautiful, truly blessed continent, people we have. So you can say I fell in love with Africa and the people of Africans, the African people, let me say. So as a development economist, my job was to figure out how can we make economies work better? How can we create effective economies? How can we create effective governance systems so that we can consistently reduce poverty? But in the practice of over about 10 years, I realized the way we're going about it needs to be tweaked. It needed to be revised. It needed to be rethought. I started to rethink, how can we do this better? So the idea that came to me was we need to make sure that we need to encourage the participation of the masses. We need to talk about development in a way that makes sense to the people on the ground. And we need to do it in a way that takes into consideration our history, our spirituality, our way of living and being, so that it makes sense to us, to the people. So it's with that intention that I established the Africa Unbound Museum as a way for us to explore who we are, to take that inward journey and understand who we are as a people, individually and also collectively. Individually, as you and me, collectively can be, within our small communities, within our nation, our continent, and also as global citizens. Brilliant. So it's a way of looking at ourselves at various levels in a very focused way, but also in a much more expanded way.
Perfect. So going back to our question, I'm going to take you back to America, and I'm going to ask you, what were you doing there? Even though you have touched a little bit on it in the beginning, I just want you to talk about it a little bit more.
Sure. I moved to the US when I was 14, in 1986. And I went to high school there. Then continued my education and completed my PhD in 2002. And then initially I was teaching economics. That was very interesting, basically teaching about economic theory and economic development. But then I felt like I needed to go into, when you're in academia, in many ways you're in a bubble. There's a bubble. So I needed to experience the real world. I wanted to go out and see what's out there. So in 2002, I joined the World Bank in Washington, and I was blessed enough to get a position within the Africa region. So they have regions, various regions, and then I was in the Africa region. So basically what we did there policy analysis. I used to work in a unit called Poverty Reduction and Economic Management. So that allowed me to work very closely with people in various government ministries and agencies across the continent. It also allowed me to meet people in the private sector who were doing very interesting work. But I also met young people in different parts of the continent who were really, really dynamic and bright and had great ideas, fantastic ideas, in many different areas. And that was very consistent. Every country that I went to, there were bright-eyed, very ambitious young people. And what was really heartbreaking for me was I knew that many of them would never have the opportunity to realize their ideas. So that's when the Africa Unbound concept started to develop. So if we don't create opportunities, the right environment, the ecosystem for these young people to be able to operationalize, develop, and come to fruition, these great ideas, they will continue to die in their minds. So that I felt was the greatest tragedy. And so I started to think about ways to make that happen, to help facilitate this process, the idea. How do you develop an idea, and how do you actually realize those ideas so you can make a difference within their communities? So it's with that intention that Africa Unbound was established. So that's what I was doing in the US. And then there was an opportunity for me. I was asked to head an organization within the ECA compound, within the UN compound here in Addis Ababa. It was established by the African Union, the ECA, and African Development Bank policy platform. I served there for one term, about a little over 2 years. And then I decided I need to do things on my own. Mm-hmm. So established my own company, the Africa Unbound Center, and we're now doing what we're doing here.
Wow, that sounds like a very interesting journey. What was the mental and the physical process to get this amazing museum off the ground? And how did you fund it? You know, funding is a big issue.
Yes, it is.
So
I talked about how or the why this organization was established. Yeah. The process of getting it started. Actually, the Africa Unbound as an organization was established when I was still in the US. So we established at that time an online platform that was publishing online magazines. This publication went on for a while, and then that became a problem because printing and also distribution was an issue. meaning, it was too costly, and at the time we were printing it here in Ethiopia, and we ran into some problems. Government was not very receptive to this. They didn't quite understand what we were doing, so they were kind of suspicious. So I decided to close that. And in its place, we established the first syndicated radio program in Africa, and it was broadcasting in 8 countries, different in the southern part, here in the east, and also west, Nigeria, Ghana, and a number of countries. So we did that for a while, but from Washington. But then when I moved here, I had a full-time job. I had a commitment to this job. I wasn't able to work on it as I did when I was in the US. So I had to close that part and focus on this assignment that I was working on. And then after a few years of hiatus, and then I was trying to figure out, okay, so what will be the next incarnation of Africa Unbound? We did the print version of the magazine, we did the online version, we had a radio program. So what will be next? So I was still thinking. And then I went to Washington, D.C. The Smithsonian African American Museum was new at the time, it had just opened. So I went to visit that museum. And I was truly inspired. It was a beautiful place, very, very, very nicely done, 7 floors. And the way everything was presented there showed me what a powerful tool a museum can be in raising consciousness and in educating the public in a way that is interesting. It's not, they don't necessarily have to take a class. They don't have.
It's visual.
It's visual, and so as we were building this museum, I kept saying, when people come here and we give them the tour, and after about an hour to hour and a half, this experience, I want them to feel like they have just read 10,000 books. So it's a beautiful way to impart a lot of knowledge and wisdom in a short period of time. So it opened my eyes to that, to the possibilities of what a museum can offer. So that's when, on the steps of the Smithsonian's African American Museum, sitting there after a full day there, I decided we also need something like this. And that's when I started working on it. You asked me about the financing. Financing is obviously a very difficult issue as we're working to operationalize our ideas. For me, I took a personal loan from bank. I don't actually recommend that I learned was not the best way to go about it because the interest rates are very, very high. So for something like this, a museum does not generate enough income to repay a loan at such a high rate. But I was so eager, I didn't want to wait for a number of things to come into place before I opened, because the idea was there. I had done the research, I had all the material ready, so I decided I just needed to make it happen. So that's how it was materialized.
Your recommendation is don't get a loan.
Well, it depends on what you do.
What you get it for, I guess.
Exactly.
Okay.
It depends. I mean, if you're in a situation where if you're doing something that can quickly generate enough income, then by all means, it's the best way to go, because you don't have to waste any. If you're absolutely sure, if you have everything ready to go, that's a good way. But otherwise, for slow, for something like this, not a good, I wouldn't recommend that.
Africa Unbound utilizes a range of simple but effective media tools to engage your audiences while telling a sophisticated story. Can you tell us about what they are and how could these tools be used in the classroom?
Okay, the tools you're saying, okay, we have the website, we utilize social media. We also have this platform that's also one tool. Can they be used within the classroom? Well, education is evolving very quickly nowadays. Learning and teaching is evolving very fast in some parts of the world. It's no longer you have the students within a classroom and then you have a certain curricula and then the teacher will come and lecture and then the students will get tested on the material. That model is changing. Education is now becoming mainly, there's a focus now for students to learn on their own. In other words, to do their own exploration, because the internet has changed how we access information and how we learn. So in a way, it's actually a really good thing because our education system is not very strong. It needs a lot of work. But our students don't necessarily have to wait until the necessary reforms are implemented within the educational system. They can learn themselves. They can teach one another. So there's enough material on the internet. YouTube, there are many tutorials on YouTube. So all of that can help students learn outside of the classroom. So the tools we use to communicate what we're doing here and communicate with our audiences can also be used for many different purposes.
Beautiful.
What we are doing here in the Africa Unbound Center is we want to sensitize that we all have dreams that we need to remember. The dreams we're talking about is what we used to think about, what we used to play with when we were children. At very young, innocent time, spaces, where we thought the whole world was open for us.
Yes.
Okay? So the name Africa Unbound itself is about reimagining a world where there are no restrictions, where we can where we can explore our talents, our passion, our skills to make a real difference in the world. So we encourage here for everybody to go back and to reconnect with that part of ourselves that imagined or that believed that anything is possible. And that's the kind of spirit that we need to cultivate in order for us to get to help co-create a reality that is that's unbound. Where things can happen and we can make things happen. When we can collaborate, when we can come together and work on ideas, develop ideas, support one another in helping realize our dreams. So we are in the business of making that world possible.
Beautiful. So I often hear you saying unleashing potential through individual minds. Mm-hmm. Can you expand on this?
Sure, that's our tagline. So the tagline, as you just said, I said, this is a transformational space. So the mind is something that can be transformed through knowledge, through the insights and the ideas that come to us and that we share, that we exchange with one another. So when we say unleashing the potential, it's about recognizing the vastness of the potential. It's about recognizing how the mind, and the way we're currently using it, is limiting us. Mm. It's limiting us in so many different ways. But when we begin to recognize how we are using the mind in very ineffective ways, and how we can correct that, and we can. So when we begin to understand how our mind works, we begin to co-create this world, a reality where the world will open up for us. So it's about focusing on how we're using the mind, or how we are not really using the mind, and effectively we're using it. So the more we begin to understand how the potential of the mind, how powerful, what a powerful tool that we actually have, then we can use it to our own benefit.
Correct. Brilliant. This question pertains to your training as a development economist, as well as your AU and your World Bank experience. What is development? Who is developed? And who is developing?
Okay, those are very, very broad questions, and these are questions that we explore here in the museum. Development can be defined in many different ways, but for our purposes here, let me just say, let's talk about the development of the mind. As I just said, we're not using the mind, the mind that we have, that's available to us in effective ways. So that's one aspect that we can focus on when we talk about what is development. How do we develop how do we build our capacity to think outside the box, right, to think and to recognize the possibilities and the potential around us. So that's, in a nutshell, that is the development, the aspect of development that we are exploring here.
Why should someone develop? How does someone, this is all about developing. Why should someone develop? How does someone develop? And how many development paths are there?
There are multiple, maybe infinite paths to development.
To develop, okay.
Yes, there is no one specific route that we can take.
Right.
Why should someone develop? To live a more fulfilling life.
Brilliant.
The more you develop your mind, the more you pay attention to how, as we learn how to use our mind more effectively, we start living a more meaningful life. And that depends on, you define that yourself. So what's meaningful to you may not be this meaningful to me. Or so we each get to define what that is for ourselves. What is a fulfilling life for you? And then, that's the driving force. Yeah, we're here for a very short period of time, so we should make the best out of it.
Very true, very true. You have a very interesting job as an economic advisor to the Prime Minister's office. What do you do? Can you talk about what unique talents you bring to the table?
I must say, your questions are brilliant.
Thank you.
Very, very, very good. It shows that you're, very skillful in what you're doing. So I'm part of a council. It's an independent council, economic advisors. It was established by the Prime Minister about a year and a half ago. And so currently there are about 14 of us. And it's a privilege to work with some highly accomplished economists. Some of them are in the diaspora, some of us are here in Ethiopia. And so basically our job or our mandate, this is not a job, it's an assignment basically, is to, as independent economists, independent meaning, it's not political, it's as independent bodies, our specific mandate is basically to recommend the right policies for our country to reduce poverty, to restructure, or right at this moment we just are now coming out of war economy. As you know, we went through a very, very difficult period over the last year and more. So how do we recover, reconstruction and recovery? How do we jumpstart economic development, the economic growth? So our task is to explore and advise the government, how do we best do that?
Okay, why did you organize the museum in the way that you did? Because it's a very different setup. And for those that haven't seen it, can actually visualize just by your words why it was done the way it is. Because we're not going to show them the museum. They're going to have to come.
Right. So the museum...
I want you to entice them to come.
The museum, it's a narrative. Okay, it tells a story. So this story is about who are we? So it goes back to 4.4 million years ago. We start there. This ground that we are sitting on now is sacred because it has been nurturing our ancestors for millions of years. So we start with that. And then we look at, this as we know, is the cradle of humanity. The human species developed here for millions of years before our ancestors went out into different parts of the world. So we start with that truth. And then we look at how has our consciousness developed over the last millions of years. And so we look at the evolution of our consciousness. And so the idea is, okay, what we're doing here is we look within. Who are we? How did we start to become who we are? And then looking into the future, who do we want to become? So what we want to do, what we're doing here is we're encouraging ourselves and each other to become conscious participants and shaping our destiny. So it's that journey that we take our audience on.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I've been to a couple of your workshops, which are very diverse, and I feel you're trying to tell a story, even by your education or your workshops and all the gatherings that you have here. What's the story?
Well, the story is basically what we have been discussing.
Right.
You know, who are we? Who do we want to become? And then how do we become conscious participants? And because each of us have a role to play, a critical role to play. So how do we become conscious participants in our own future, in our reality, you know? So it's to raise awareness that we do have the capacity to shape our destiny or to shape our reality. And how do we do that? It's the how part that we are exploring here.
So you do that by different workshops, different educators coming here and having lectures?
Right. We have workshops, we have trainings, we have classes we provide. So through all of those, the workshops and the trainings have been really transformational and a very rewarding experience for us. We have been trained, the managers and directors of commercial banks, our banks in Ethiopia here in Addis Ababa, or not just Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia. We've also engaged fresh university graduates. We've offered different classes to high school students. And then we have programs for mid-level professionals as well. So it's for various levels, and it's really been deeply transformational and very, very fulfilling for us.
I'm just going to stick this question right here, because if people don't know that you exist, so basically my question is, how do you find your workshops, your lecturers, or even the people that take the classes? Do you go around offering these services, or do they come to you?
It's both. We have introduced our services at various platforms. I've given interviews, a few, not very many, but a few interviews. And then sometimes they come to us. Companies who have heard about what we're doing have called us, and they've come to us. So yeah, both ways.
That's good. That's brilliant.
We were the we were the first physicians, and we talk about that here we feature Emotep in our exhibit here. We Africans were the first physicians, the first philosophers, the first architects, astronomers, scientists.
We were the first in everything.
First prophets. And, when we look at where we are today, we have to question what happened. And when we look around, we have everything we need. Absolutely we have the land, we have the sun, we have the water, the rivers are flowing, the minerals. There's nothing that we don't have. And then we have the people. So what do we need? What are we missing? We need to raise our consciousness about who we are. And we need to recognize what we have available to us.
So it starts with basically recognizing who you are as an individual, as an African, and then can go out to the mass.
Exactly, yes. Unless we know ourselves, we cannot know the world.
Yeah.
So that's a precondition. I mean,
Exactly.
you cannot sidestep that process. So we have to look within, and we have to ask ourselves, who are we today?
Yeah.
Who were we? And so there is a section in our museum that showcases what our ancestors were doing and how they raised children, with the understanding that a child has infinite capacity, and every child comes with a gift to the world. So imagine if we raised every child knowing that child has something unique, that's something so precious to contribute to the world. How would we raise our children? How would we treat one another? If we really understood that there's a certain specific gift that you have that nobody else has in the world, exactly. That is just unique to you. So there are many such wisdom that we showcase here, and that we need to go back and we need to understand, what did our ancestors know that we don't currently know, or we have forgotten, or we're not practicing? They had conflict resolution mechanisms, they had peace building mechanisms. So with that understanding, once we go back and we look at who we were, and then once we understand, we define what kind of future do we want? What kind of life do we want to live? Who do we want to be? Once we understand that, then it's easier to come up with ways to make that happen.
How do you find working in Ethiopia versus working in the United States? And if there was one thing you would change, what would it be?
How would I find it working here? Fulfilling.
Brilliant.
Challenging,
but
also very fulfilling. There is an opportunity here to make a difference,
right.
To do something in your own way. It's not easy, but it's deeply fulfilling. In a nutshell, that's how I would put it.
Okay. How's the traffic in Ethiopia? I just thought I'd jump.
The worst thing about Ethiopia is really the traffic.
Is the traffic?
I can say, it's...
because of the way they drive, or because of just the traffic in general?
The orderlessness of it. It shows us who we are in a not so pleasant way.
I know.
So, it teaches you a lot about yourself.
About yourself, thank you.
Yeah,
we'll just leave it at that, I know. So, we have finally gotten a Pan-African leader who has a lot of new and creative ideas. How can we correspond with this as a people to help his vision come to life?
Great question. Another wonderful question. Yeah. You see, I think seeing ourselves as Africans, first and foremost, really, connecting with the idea of being an African. We see these signs all over the city now. I'm proud to be African. I am an African. All of these things. So, but what does that really mean? When we really think about it, what that helps us do is it helps us see ourselves in expanded ways. So instead of, seeing yourself as a very, right now here we're in Arada sub-city. So instead of seeing ourselves as Yarada Lij or Piazza Lij or Mercato Lij or Addis Ababa, or as we really begin to see ourselves in expanded ways as Ethiopians and then as Africans, our reality shifts. It's not just a label that we're giving ourselves, but the more we understand what that means, we are expanding our world. We're cultivating a sense of connection to not just the few people that are around us, because we're very, 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 very alike. 99.999% we are alike, we are the same. In terms of our physical being, we're almost exactly the same. what differentiates us is our aspirations, our fears, our hopes. These are the things that differentiate one from the other. And these things should be reasons to come together.
Right.
So when we begin to see ourselves in expanded ways, in larger ways, it benefits ourselves. You know, we become more of who we are. We are able to connect, collaborate with, network with lots of different kinds of people, and then we can make things happen. We can begin to realize our ideas. So we make our world larger by seeing ourselves as Pan-Africanists.
Within this, I'm going to put in, since you know, the month of February is African American month.
Yes.
And you've lived in the States, and now you're here. During this month, is there anything that the African Unbound Museum actually teaches or does? Or do you have events around this time?
We're preparing an event very soon. We're in preparation for it. As you said, February is Black History Month in the US. But for those of us living here, it's Black History Month every day.
I know.
Every month is Black History Month. We live our history, we live our heritage every day. But they needed to create that in order to raise awareness that there's so much to being a Black person in America. Black people did not know their history, and this was very intentional. It's a good way to disempower people when they don't know their history. So we have a lot to learn from them, because we here, Ethiopians, mm-hmm. we know very little about our history. Our history has been adulterated in many ways. There's no one history, of course, but we need to begin to explore, we need to understand what has happened, what has allowed us to live our lives today, or the challenges that we're facing today. What is the root cause? What are the root causes? And not so much dwell in the past. I mean, we only need to go to the past so that we can begin to understand some of the key issues. But what we do here, and what I very much promote, is for us to focus more of our attention on the possibilities of the future. You know, what can we do now? What kind of Ethiopia do we want to build? What kind of Africa do we want to build? So in that way, we can learn from the experiences of the African Americans. They have learned a lot about their history. They have taught us a lot about our history because of the exploration that they have conducted. So we have benefited in so many ways from them. The civil rights movement is something that we need to learn from. The nonviolent, the peaceful movement that led to some serious changes and reforms in the American history, led by the likes of Martin Luther King and others. We also need to learn a lot from those experiences so we can begin to rebuild our country and our continent and start to build the world that we want to live in.
Do you think Pan-Africanism and ethnic-centric thinking can work together?
It's a brilliant question. It truly is a brilliant question. Pan-Africanism and ethnocentrism. When we become ethnocentric, we're focusing on certain aspect of ourselves. You know, ethnicity is about a group of, a community that shares certain language. It may or may not be religion, based on religion, certain geographical space. These things define our ethnicity. But most people in the world are multi-ethnic. You know, and the world, as we become more and more globalized, we're not just becoming multi-ethnic, we're also becoming multinational, more and more global. So that's the world that we are moving into. So to limit ourselves to a certain ethnic group is to limit our world, is to limit our capacity as human beings. So that doesn't necessarily mean we don't appreciate our ethnicity or we dismiss it in any way. What we're talking about is exploring different versions of ourselves, or different levels, different aspects of who we are. So our ethnicity is something, but it's not everything. We are all kinds of different things at the same time. You know, I am of 3 ethnic groups in Ethiopia, but I'm also African. There's a part of me that feels very connected to America because I've lived there for 27 years. And there's a part of me that feels global at the same time. So I can be all of that.
Right.
And I hope we begin to see ourselves in that way, because the more we see ourselves in more expanded ways, possibilities open for us.
Absolutely. I agree. Beautiful. So today we brought you Dr. Rahel Kassahun from the Africa Unbound. We are actually sitting within the African Unbound where we're having this conversation. Now, to close our conversation, I want to give you a chance, if there's anything you want to add.
Thank you so much for creating this show. Very much needed. You're filling a huge gap.
Thank you.
And you're just the right person for it. So you are an example of doing something that is genuinely you. When we do ourselves, when we tap into the inner part of ourselves, we always come up with something unique and something
that's you.
Meaningful. That's you. And you've done that with this show, and thank you very much.
Thank you for being my guest today.